The Prime Minister looks set to block an intended 9% rise in the BBC licence fee, warning the corporation that it must be realistic with what the public can afford to pay.
But any interference would be a breach of the 6-year funding agreement proposed by the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and some claim it could leave the corporation lagging behind competitors. Well, the Culture Secretary, Lucy Frazer, joins us now. Very good morning to you, Lucy Frazer.
Good morning.
So the agreement was a 2-year freeze, and then the BBC licence fee would go up in line with inflation. Are you likely to break that promise?
The issue that we've got here is that we want to ensure is that people are protected from cost of living issues, and we've done that as a government broadly in a number of ways, and that's why we froze the licence fee. That's why we froze the licence fee 2 years ago. It is due to rise with inflation, and it will be a rising in line with inflation, but we need to look at what the rate of inflation is to ensure that we protect as many people as possible from those rising prices.
So the figure is usually calculated by using the Consumer Prices Index to work out average inflation, which works out at around 9%. It would take the annual licence fee to £173.30. That's almost £15 more than the current frozen fee. And this would be the largest increase for decades. So what are you suggesting, that you'll just pick a different measure and increase it by less?
Well, that's absolutely right. What you've just said is absolutely right. A 9% rise is a significant sum for people across the country. And therefore, it's really important that we look at that and see whether there's any other rate that we can do that doesn't give them that significant rise, but still does give the BBC some funds in order to provide its services. We've got to think about this in the round, actually. 400,000 people chose not to renew their licence fee. If it goes up by too much, then we will see significant people not renewing their licence fee, and that will be no good for the revenues of the BBC either. So what we need to do is come to something that is fair, and also we need to look at the licence fee in the round, and that's why my department and I are currently doing a review into the long-term sustainability of the BBC and the appropriate way that it should be funded.
Well, I can imagine this is all quite chilling for my former employer to hear. The BBC's charter is up for renewal in 2027. One of the reasons that so many people still pay their licence fee is, of course, it's a criminal offence not to, with a fine of up to £1,000. Do you still back the fact that it is a criminal offence not to pay your licence fee? Because if you decide to decriminalise it, of course, that would have consequences for funding as well.
Whether it's or not is a criminal offence is something that I am concerned about. I don't think it is appropriate to be prosecuted for failing to pay a licence fee, and that is something that we will definitely be looking at the Charter review.
Culture Secretary, for the last week, the Prime Minister has been dealing with the fallout from his decision last Monday to cancel his meeting with the Greek Prime Minister because of what he'd said about cultural matters the day before. Did you advise the Prime Minister to cancel that meeting?
No, I didn't advise the Prime Minister to cancel that meeting. The Prime Minister doesn't need my advice on who to meet and who not to meet. Right. But I think the context for that is that he had asked the Greek Prime Minister not to raise this issue because he wanted to discuss some very important subjects that we are working with them on, and that was the context in which that decision was made.
I was talking last week to the chairman of the British Museum, the former Chancellor George Osborne, who said that he doesn't need the agreement of the Prime Minister or yourself to do a deal with Greece to allow the Elgin Marbles to go back for a temporary period, so long as it doesn't change the law. But presumably, I'm sure you've had meetings with George Osborne in his capacity as chair of the British Museum over the last month. Had you agreed with him that it was a good idea for the British Museum to have some kind of temporary arrangement to allow the Elgin Marbles to go back to Greece for a period of time?
I regularly have meetings with the chair of all the museums that fall within DCMS, and I have had meetings, of course, with George Osborne, and I know that this is something that he is working on. The position is that the UK has looked after these the Elgin Marbles for a number of years very carefully. They're in the British Museum for millions of people to see. The British Museum is one of the most visited attractions in the UK, if not in the world. The Elgin Marbles are owned by the trustees of the British Museum, having been legally acquired, and the law prevents them from being removed from the British Museum.
So if you had had meetings with George Osborne and agreed with him that without a change in the law, a temporary agreement to allow the Elgin Marbles to go back to Greece for a period of time was a good idea, it would have been a bit surprising for you suddenly to see the Prime Minister cancelling a meeting with the Greek Prime Minister over that very issue and causing such a diplomatic storm. Maybe he ought to have asked your advice, because you could have told him have the meeting and not caused all this furore.
Well, just to correct you, I haven't had any meeting with George Osborne where I've agreed anything with him at all. Of course, we discuss a variety of issues, but I've never agreed with him any position in relation to the Elgin Marbles.
So George Osborne wasn't negotiating that with your blessing?
The position is that if the Elgin Marbles were to be returned to Greece, Greece would have to accept that they were legally owned by the British Museum. Anyway, George Osborne, I'm sure, understands all these issues.
Yeah, I know. I think that it's the reason why he was a bit mystified, like me and maybe you, that the Prime Minister suddenly cancels his meeting, because actually, you know, it was all going smoothly until then.
Well, the Prime Minister has views on this issue. As I said, there was a context in which that decision had been reached. The Prime Minister, I should say, is leading on the world front in relation to relations with a large number of world leaders. We've seen that in the Global Investment Summit that we had last week. We've seen that in the global meeting that he held in relation to AI. We've seen that in the Trans-Pacific Partnership that's been agreed, the AUKUS agreement that's been reached, and the Prime Minister is leading on the world stage, working very, very cooperatively with leaders across the world.
I go back to the point I made. If he's talking about tax, he'll speak to the Chancellor, and if he's talking about climate change, he'll speak to the Climate Change Secretary, and on the matter of the Elgin Marbles, he ought to have talked to you in advance, and then he wouldn't have messed it up.
I don't agree with you that he messed it up. And, of course, I speak to the Prime Minister on a wide variety of issues regularly.
All right, Lucy Frazer, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.